Good morning and good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Fishing in the Twilight Zone, Illuminating Governance Challenges at the Next Fisheries Frontier. So a warm welcome to everyone. We're very happy to have you to join us today. It's going to be a very exciting program. So what we will like to do is we will first start with saying that this is part of a knowledge series that was actually initiated to kind of keep the momentum going between the IGC3 and IGC4. So it's part of a series on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, but basically building that ambition. And what we thought was very timely to do was also, as many things have been postponed, was also to have a focus on a little bit more of a knowledge series that can actually highlight new research that's becoming available that could also help inform this treaty. So we're very pleased to have this webinar today. As I said, it's a joint effort between IUCN, also our commissions and specialist groups, and the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, DOSI. And this series is actually sponsored by the Swedish government. And actually today's knowledge series is actually introducing science and ecology of the mesopelagic zone. And it will kind of explore potential governance challenges for sustainable development of new fisheries. So we all know that the mesopelagic zone, it's a very important one. It also has a critical role in the global carbon. It's important for food webs, but there is still a lot of significant scientific knowledge gaps. So we're hoping that we will have some of these filled today. And there's also a lot of interest in the mesopelagic, especially in exploring commercial fisheries. So we're very delighted that this webinar, it was the initiative of IDDRI, which is the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, and they're based out of Paris. So it was their initiative to hold this, and it was very timely as well with a new report, which you will hear a little bit about more later. So I would, again, thank you very much. And I hope you'll find this very enlightening discussions. We have some great presentations. And I'm also pleased to introduce Glenn Wright, and he is the senior researcher at IDDRI. So he'll be moderating today's webinar and will be introducing the panel. And there will also be a Q&A at the end. But I would say once again, thank you very much. And I hand over to Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minna, and hello everyone. It's good to, well, not see you, but glad to see you all there in the participants list, even if we can't be together in person. I won't say much by way of introduction, just thank you very much to IUCN for joining us and the Blue Marine Foundation to organize this webinar. As Minna mentioned, this webinar is launching two reports, one on governance issues done by IDDRI, and Christina is a co-author on that, one of our speakers later. And Callum, who will speak second, is the lead author of a paper on the science of the mesopelagic zone, particularly fisheries. So those two reports are sort of somewhat complementary and serendipitous that we were working on them at similar times. So we're hoping to give a bit of an introduction here in this webinar to the science and ecology of the mesopelagic zone, and then also to some of the governance challenges that we see with the possibility of commercial fisheries developing in the future. The webinar will be recorded, so will be watchable later, and we'll also send links to those reports out with the recording. So with that, I'm very grateful to introduce Heidi Sosik, who is a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. She is the director of the Woods Hole Center for Ocean, Marine and Seafloor Observing Systems, and also leading the Ocean Twilight Zone project there. And actually, I first became aware of Heidi's research, especially on the mesopelagic, watching her TED Talk, which as of last week, when I checked, had close to 1.5 million views. So very grateful to have you with us, Heidi, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this panel As Glenn said, at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, I'm helping to lead our multi-year Ocean Twilight Zone project. The team includes scientists, engineers, and communicators, and we're all working together to learn new things about life in the mesopelagic, to develop new technologies that help to accelerate the pace of that discovery, and also to build partnerships so that we can share what we learn and make sure that the highest quality science has far-reaching impacts. On this slide, you're seeing some of the fascinating creatures that inhabit the Twilight Zone, but it's important to keep in mind that this vast habitat is huge, and the animals are like this are usually far apart, even hard to find. This view out the porthole of a submersible at about 500 meters shows what it really looks like most of the time. I'm not sure if you see that, yeah, the video's playing. There's this utterly amazing blizzard of marine snow, which of course isn't snow at all, but this organic matter rich debris and plankton that are raining down from the sunlit surface layer above. We sometimes simplify the definition of the Twilight Zone to be about 200 to 1,000 meters below the surface, but the zone is better defined by the amount of light that penetrates, where the top is where sunlight becomes too dim for photosynthesis to take place. Yet there's still enough light that specially adapted animals living there can detect day-night cycles, allowing them to participate in this massive daily migration. Small fish and plankton move hundreds of meters into the surface water to feed at night, and then they return to depths during the day to avoid visual predators. And this amazing migration happens over a huge part of the globe because the mesopelagic is a half-mile thick layer that spans from the Arctic to the Antarctic. So as scientists, we're super interested in learning a lot more about the mesopelagic ecosystem. But what does this mean for all of us? Our team, as part of the Ocean Twilight Zone project, has last year published a report describing the array of services that the Twilight Zone provides to humans. And I'll just highlight a few points from that work here. Two important benefits from the Twilight Zone are the removal of heat trapping carbon from the atmosphere, a regulating service, and sustaining of commercially important fisheries, a supporting service. So first, a bit about the supporting service. Life in the Twilight Zone is diverse, fascinating, and important. Even top predators such as sharks, whales, swordfish, and tuna all rely on the Twilight Zone ecosystem, where connections within the food web and between ocean layers are complex and multifaceted. Our team is actively tracking large pelagic animals to describe and quantify their behaviors. And one thing is clear: the more we track these animals, the more we learn how much time they actually spend in the Twilight Zone. It appears to be a very important foraging habitat for them. Now, a little bit about regulating services. The Twilight Zone plays a critical role in the ocean carbon cycle. Biological processes in the mesopelagic are responsible for sequestering between 2 and 6 billion metric tons of carbon annually. This is at least double, perhaps as much as 6 times the amount of carbon emitted by all automobiles worldwide. So this has an estimated value of 300 to 900 billion annually. Now, this isn't new information. Scientists have known that the ocean plays an essential role in capturing carbon from the atmosphere for a long time, but the efficiency of the ocean's biological pump remains uncertain, and this has significant implications for future climate policy. So the major topic of this webinar is Twilight Zone fisheries, and we'll hear more from the other panel speakers about that. In addition to any direct benefit that might result from fishing, we have now, I want to bring up these extremely important supporting and regulating services, services that are valuable in direct economic terms. And we need to consider trade-offs. What will we gain? What will we lose from actions that could affect Ocean Twilight Zone ecosystem services? And in order to consider those trade-offs, we need information. And that's what our project is targeting, along with other research efforts around the world. So because despite being so beneficial in having this array of services, the Twilight Zone, I think it's fair to say, is virtually unexplored. We have many fundamental knowledge gaps around what lives there, how much animal biomass is there, what do they eat, how fast do they grow, how do they reproduce. And we have this rare opportunity because things like large-scale industrial fishing impacts are just in their infancy. We have an opportunity to make sure that we get out ahead of those impacts and understand the ecosystem well enough to institute sustainable policies. So the Ocean Twilight Zone project I mentioned was funded starting in 2018 as part of the TED Audacious project, a philanthropic initiative focused on helping to meet this challenge of filling the knowledge gap. So as I mentioned at the outset, the project is highly interdisciplinary, and we have a focus on 3 pillars: scientific impact, technology advance, and broad engagement. And we're bringing together scientists, engineers, and communications experts with a shared vision to promote impact. We want to not only advance new scientific knowledge, but also promote broad awareness about the ocean and its value to humanity, and ultimately ensure that scientific knowledge is used effectively in developing responsible policies. So in terms of directly addressing knowledge gaps, our project covers these major themes. We need much better estimates of the mass and diversity of fish and other animals in the mesopelagic. We need to know who is eating who in the intricate food webs, how the animals' behaviors help them find food and thrive in the Twilight Zone. And we need to know how long they live, how long it takes them to reproduce, essential characteristics to define appropriate yields for any fishery. And finally, we need to understand in detail the ways life in the Twilight Zone affects the global carbon cycle and in turn, the regulation of Earth's climate. So answering these critical questions requires new ways of observing this challenging part of the ocean. At the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, we're working hard to meet this challenge by building on our long track record of intensive partnerships between scientists and engineers to push technology forward. As part specifically of the Ocean Twilight Zone project, we're working on with partners to advance acoustic and imaging approaches to measure animals, ultra-sensitive radiometers to track light levels, high volume in situ samplers for environmental DNA to help characterize biodiversity, things like small, relatively inexpensive floats with cameras that let us directly measure marine snow and how it's being transformed in deep ocean layers. Animal tags that have much more precise geolocation and allow us to more carefully map the behaviors and how they're interacting with the Twilight Zone, and a series of new tow bodies and customized autonomous vehicles that are specifically designed to help us address the knowledge gaps. I want to conclude my remarks by saying that as we look forward to this grand vision of a highly integrated and sustained ocean observing system for the mesopelagic, that it's really great for me to be part of a forum like this so that we can continue to push forward with our interest in developing partnerships and collaborations. This is a big ocean. These are big challenges. We're talking about a vast, important ecosystem, and we're committed to coming together with partners to address these challenges so that we can promote knowledge and sustainable practices. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Heidi, for that introduction. So now we'll move on to Callum Roberts, who used to be a professor at the University of York, which is why I have York in my mind, but is now a professor of marine conservation at the University of Exeter, and also a chief scientific advisor at the Blue Marine Foundation, who, as I mentioned, released a report today on the role of mesopelagic fishes in these ecosystems. Callum has worked for a long time on coral reef science and has also written a number of excellent popular science books about the ocean. So very much looking forward, Callum, to hearing about the work that you've been doing on mesopelagic fishes.
Thanks very much, Glenn. And thank you, Heidi, for a wonderful introduction to the mesopelagic zone. And you know, I first heard about the mesopelagic and mesopelagic fish during the earliest days of being a marine biologist in the early 1980s. And at that time, I was working in the Red Sea region, and I heard about explorations of the Arabian Sea and the enormous biomass of mesopelagic fish that people were discovering there, and the enthusiasm for converting those fish into something for people to eat. It turned out there were a few technical problems that needed to be overcome in order to make that into a viable fishery. And over the ensuing decades, those technical problems have not been overcome as yet, although we'll hear more about how we're exploring the possibility of fisheries later today. But it's a bit like deep sea mining, whereby, you know, everyone was out there exploring in the 1960s and 70s, and they thought that this would be the next big thing. It was imminent, but it hasn't been that way. But just like deep sea mining, we are on the cusp, really, of viability. And one of the things that is driving that is the great demand which is developed for resources to feed the world's burgeoning aquaculture industry. And so that was the motivation, really, for my own team, made up of some colleagues from the University of York and Exeter, to dive into the mesopelagic and wonder about the wisdom or not of exploiting this region. And I'm particularly grateful to Beth O'Leary for leading out on this piece of work. So going back to Heidi's presentation, I think there are three things that suggest to us that the mesopelagic and the zone as a whole is an essential part of ocean ecosystem functioning. And the immense abundance. I was bowled over when I read the paper in Nature by Irigoyen et al. At the possibility that there might be most of the ocean's fish residing in this layer below the surface. At the time, conventional wisdom had it that, you know, the biggest biomass had to be in the zone of photosynthesis in the epipelagic. But here was something which said, no, that there is this greater biomass below. And as Heidi says, that needs to be verified. We need more evidence about the distribution and the abundance of these species, but certainly echo sounder traces which show this kind of floor in the ocean at a mesopelagic depths suggest there is an immense biomass there. And the other thing about this amazing zone is the migration. And I wish I had Woods Hole style animations, but you've seen it now about how this migration goes up and down between this kind of photic zone and the deeper depths. And that means that it's got to be incredibly important in terms of ocean processes, this particular zone. So roughly estimated in this paper, there could be something like 90% of all the fish in the ocean residing within this mesopelagic zone. They are exquisitely beautiful, as you have seen from the images that we've been showing in this webinar so far. And thanks to Dante Fenolio for these gorgeous pictures that he's taken of fish in the mesopelagic zone. And the important role that they might play in the ocean carbon cycle is due to this shuttling movement between deep and shallow waters. So they are one of these species that feeds shallow and poops deep. And in doing so, that carbon that is picked up from these nutrient-rich, food-rich waters towards the surface is being shuttled down into the deeper layers below the thermocline, can be released there, which helps to speed the trapping of that organic matter in the deep sea, and thereby helps with the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There's another important role, though, which is less well understood and which may yet be very important, and that is because many of these mesopelagic fish are teleosts. They produce gut carbonates, little kind of carbonate rocks precipitated in the guts, and that's part of the extraction of calcium from seawater that is breathed in as the animals are oxygenating themselves. And so what these gut carbonates do, it's a way of getting rid of that and that material that the fish do, it's passed out of the gut. If they're creating these gut carbonates deep down, as Rod Wilson from the University of Exeter has shown, and then they are excreting them up in the surface waters when they go up there to feed, then this could actually be a really important way of transferring alkalinity from the deep ocean up to the shallow ocean, and maybe a means of counteracting higher ocean acidities towards the surface as carbon dioxide is dissolving in surface waters. So there's this important shuttling of carbon, organic carbon, from the surface to the deep waters, but there's also this kind of reverse upward alkalinity pump, which may well be important in counteracting ocean acidification. We've heard about their role as provisioning resources, and given the incredible abundance that mesopelagic fish have, it would be very surprising if they weren't important in ocean food webs. And who can forget the scenes from BBC's Blue Planet 2 and from the Netflix series of spinner dolphins in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, and these superpods, which are thousands of animals strong. The estimate for the Netflix superpod that was filmed was something like 10,000 spinner dolphins. And here you can see them foraging alongside tuna on lanternfish that have been kind of trapped right up at the surface. And we don't know quite how that works, but it seems likely that these animals are basically intercepting the migration of these mesopelagic fish, and they're really preventing them from the downward part of the migration. And at certain times, in certain places, these fish must be enormously important in the diet of these animals. They're certainly important in the diets of some other animals that we find interesting for reasons of consumption. And so yellowfin tuna, for example, is a fish that has been associated with the same locations of spawning aggregations of lanternfish off the coast of Australia, for example. And so one of the things that we've done in this report is to dive into what is known about the diets of fish and how much of these top predatory species diets is made up of mesopelagic fish. And what we looked at was a whole range of studies of tunas and sharks going back to the 1990s. Each of these columns represents the contribution of different parts of the diet to each of the species labeled under the columns. And so we can see that you've got mesopelagic fish is the white zone of the column. Then there's various other fish in the light gray, crustaceans, mid-gray, cephalopods, dark gray, some of which are likely mesopelagic, and other organisms black. And so what you can see is that there is a significant contribution of mesopelagic fish to the diets of many of these predators, and particularly deep diving things or deep living things. And so big-eyed tuna, for example, renowned for being a deep living, deep diving species of tuna that has something like a quarter of the diet is made up of mesopelagic fish from this particular sampling. And these samples were not taken in places where perhaps there's a greater likelihood of encountering mesopelagic fish in the diet, but recognize that there is a great deal of variability between places and times in the contribution that mesopelagic fish and other life makes to the diet of these animals, and that in some places at some times they may be particularly critically important. And I was just reading a very recent paper which has come out in 2020, looking at the diet of great white sharks off the west coast of the Americas, and looking at how you can trace the origin of their diet based on the methyl mercury composition within the tissues. And what they found was that basically something like 3/4 of the methyl mercury that these sharks were accumulating was based on mesopelagic food sources. So essentially these great white sharks are diving deep and they're renowned for it, from the White Shark Cafe in the Eastern Pacific, and they are hunting mesopelagic prey. And big-eyed tuna, which we eat, means that we're also eating quite a lot of mesopelagic fish indirectly. This is the famous seared ahi tuna from Hawaii, and in each of those chunks of flesh, there is a significant proportion of protein and fat derived from these mesopelagic resources. And as Heidi said, that role that they play in the kind of regulating service of extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, one estimate, which needs to be verified, and I'm hopeful that Heidi's project will be putting some more flesh onto these estimates, is that there could be 50% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That would take us way above the sort of levels at which we will see major disruption of the global climate, high levels of heating from the atmosphere. And so these particular fish can be playing an immensely important role in keeping the planetary temperature down. And that really brings us to the point about exploitation of these fish and fisheries. And of course, being a big resource, a lot of people are suddenly attracted to them, particularly those who are worried about where will the fish come from to feed aquaculture initiatives, for example, the burgeoning human population. This is a resource, and it's seen as a resource which can be obtained cheaply and in bulk. But what we are saying is that we've made mistakes in the past in exploiting the oceans. We have seen very large scale extraction of marine resources from the sea. That extraction has been unwise and has caused immense disruption to ocean ecosystems. What's to stop us doing that again? And here's a particular part of the ocean ecosystem that is vitally important. We know that, and we need to potentially pause. So the Horizon 2020, one of the projects that you'll hear about in a moment, is funded by EU Horizon 2020. And it says, if exploited at sustainable levels without impacting upon biodiversity and compromising the ocean's roles in climate regulation, this biomass of mesopelagic fish could be used to produce more high quality ingredients. Indeed, if, and that is the big problem that we are drawing attention to today, is that things have gone wrong in the past. We don't know enough about these animals to know how many we can safely exploit, or how or where from, but we do know enough to know that they are vitally important, and tinkering with this resource without understanding them better is potentially very unwise. And so Blue Marine Foundation is calling for a moratorium on fishing the mesopelagic zone until we have found out more and we can properly plan and regulate exploitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Callum. And as Callum mentioned at the end there, there's a couple of Horizon 2020 projects funded by the EU looking at the ecology and the potential for exploitation of these fisheries and how it might be managed. So we're very lucky to have with us Rachel Tiller from Sintef Ocean in Norway. And she is part of the Summer Project, which is sustainable management of mesopelagic resources. And so she will give us an overview of I think they're a year into this project, so what the project's about and what you're aiming to do. So thank you very much, Rachel, for being with us.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you to Callum and to Heidi. I'll now go on to introduce this project that I'm a part of. So my name is Rachel Tiller. I'm a senior research scientist at Sintef Ocean in Norway, and we're one of the partners of one of these projects that Callum referred to, the summer project, and where we do have this big question of if. And that is what I want to highlight in this as well. It's 10 countries that are participating in this one project. There's 2 projects actually that were funded at the same time. Mine is the one that's called Summer, the Sustainable Management of Marine Resources. And just quickly, these are the things I'll be going through because these are the main topics of this project. And it goes back to what Callum and Heidi has been talking about. How much can we catch of this stuff? Is there going to be a bycatch? What is the role of this, this mesopelagic resource in the food web? How will it affect carbon capture? And what are we going to use it for? I see the introduction to this said, well, this is nothing anybody wants. Well, we've said that before and we've eaten it still. So are we just going to use it all for fish meal, or are we going to actually start eating it ourselves? And then comes to one of the critical points. What are the tipping points between what it does and what we want? So that said, trying to wave here. Yeah, so how much can we catch of this? So as Callum was saying, there could perhaps be 10 billion. So Xavier, whose article he referred to, that's what the estimate was. Well, we're not finding it so far. And bear in mind, I'm doing this from a Norwegian perspective. This project, like all the others around the world right now, have been cut off dramatically in terms of their cruises. So, but we did manage in Norway to get in a couple of cruises before the pandemic came, and in those little windows we had. And we have tried to find it, and we do search for it. And we do know, as Callum said, even just 1% of this 10 billion, it would feed the entire Norwegian aquaculture industry. We're not finding it though. So that is what we're doing in this project. And this also refers back to what Heidi was saying. We're also using some of these same methods, the IDDRI. We're looking at submersible broadband acoustics. We're trying to find ways to find them, find out where they are. We do know that they grow really fast. We know they can reproduce within 60 days. We've never seen them become older than 2 years, but they can double themselves in 2 months. And this is, again, referring to the Norwegian case and where we're looking at one specific one. So in terms of that, we have found out a lot. But Mueller's pearlside is only one of many species that are there, but that is what we're finding the most of in the Northeast Atlantic. There's my hand. So also bycatch, when we're catching these, are we catching everything else as well? You figure that you would catch a lot of it, and that was one of the big worries. That's what we want to try to find out here. Are we basically vacuuming the ocean, trying to find these little critters? So far, what we've seen is that we're towing it so slowly that everything is just swimming right out of it. We're not catching anything but mesopelagics in what we're doing. So we're basically catching mainly krill and Mueller's pearlside, and they're tiny little things. But we're not catching any of the big commercially important species while doing this. Again, because this mainly is so slow that they're swimming out. We've had cameras down filming. So those are some of the things that we are trying to test out in many different waters, not just Norwegian waters. But again, mainly this will be from the Norwegian results. We do get a lot of siphonophores though, and those are jellyfish. We get lots of those. So I'll get back to that a little bit later, but that is one of the challenges. We think there's lots of it, but there's really just a bunch of jellyfish. So trophic services, the role in the food web. That is also obviously something that is really, really important to find out. Who eats it? Are we just now fishing down the food web? And then the big question is, of course, is that so bad? I mean, you see pictures of the tuna. That's at the top of the food web. If we were eating that on land, we'd be eating the dragon eaters, right? So we're eating really high up in the food web already. Why are we not thinking about going a little bit further down to actually eat the grains? That is another thing we're looking at in this project, to find out whether or not that might not be a good thing, rather than only eating the tuna and the cod and the whatever else is at the top. Start eating some of the grains of the ocean instead. Start eating some of the zooplankton, some of the stuff that are further down that we actually do eat on land. These are the things we're looking at in this project. And then we also want to know what both Callum and Heidi was talking about, the CO2. carbon capture. If we start harvesting this, if it turns out we can find them, we can find out where and when and how much we should take, is that going to affect carbon capture, and is that worth it? Of course it's not worth it. Those are things that we're looking at in this project as well. And then a really important thing for the industry partners, we have part of this project. What are we going to use them for? Are we going to only basically make meal out of them and serve them to the salmon when there's so much of it? We do eat grains on land. Shouldn't we not be starting to eat this ourselves? And who's going to eat it, right? So these are also something we're looking at. We do compare it sometimes to herring, that in the beginning, 90% of it went straight to fish meal, and today 90% is being eaten by humans. We've also done studies, at least in Norway, where we see that some people want to eat this. There tend to be the younger generation. My generation tend to not want to eat it. But with good marketing, like we did with the herring, this might also become something humans will want. And then we have the trade-offs that both Callum especially, but also Heidi talked a lot about. Do we really want to do this? In this project, what we do is we also talk to both industry, we talk to governance, and we go across the board trying to find out what the tipping points are. We get the results from all the other work packages and try to do analysis on, is it worth it? Should we really be doing this? And before you get too worried, Heidi is on the advisory board of our project as well. And this is a project where we look at the sustainability. Should we be doing this? This is not a project where we're saying, this is how we're going to do it. We're looking to see if we should even be doing this. So, I'm leaving. Yeah, so then the moral of the story, again, what do we know so far? We're a year in. We know they're really hard to find. All estimates and all thoughts before we went into this was like, hey, we're going to go out. There's going to be lots and lots of this. We're going to find a new source from the marine area. This is going to be great. Again, 1% will feed all the salmon in Norway. This is going to be perfect. And so far, not so much. In 2020, the Mueller's pearl-side stock in Norway was only estimated really to 15,000 tons. But we only managed to find 1,300 of it. And in 4 years of going out with one of our partners, so far we've only had one catch that had any commercial value at all. And in terms of that value, it was really low. We spent about 150,000 euros going out to find it, and we managed to catch for 16,000 euros. So this is also a very expensive fishery. And it's also no guarantees, which means that unless there's really very little incentive for industry to want to invest in this. There's not enough funding for really us to do it without industry participating. Those are already out there. We do know there's a really high demand for it. There's a lot of, everybody, not everybody, but there's a lot of demand for fish meal. And again, this feeds into not just aquaculture, but poultry. Any kind of animal feed uses fish meal and fish oil. So, but in terms of this one right now, even if we do find it, we can't use it commercially yet because it's not MSC certified. Because MSC certification, it will demand a time series on stock estimates, management plans, totally allowable catch, and we cannot do any of those things until we know where they are and when. So this is a really complex issue. And it's really difficult to find out even if it is sustainable. And then finally, how are we going to govern it? Christina will talk about that after me. And this is also one of the things we'll be doing in this project. But right now, it's seeing we are going a lot into international waters to try to catch it. Because these 10 billion tons, they're not within EEZs. Some of them are there, but they're going to be further out. So you're going to need to go into an area that does not have any kind of governance mechanisms for this yet. And likely nor will it have anything all-encompassing, even with a BBNJ treaty. So, I'm trying to wave there. So there, that's what I've got. You can follow us on Twitter. We're of course also on the website if you want to find out more, if you want to follow the project and find out what happens. But in general, this is where we are 1 year into this project. We still have the same questions both Heidi and Callum came with. We are finding out a little bit, mainly, that these are really difficult to find. We don't know when, where, or how much of it we are going to find. It's really hard to actually even consider if they will be sustainable to harvest it in the future. But with that, I'll move it over to Christina.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's great to get the inside perspective on what one of these projects is looking at, and interesting to think that maybe regulation won't be needed if the fish become avoidant themselves and, and can't be found. So we'll move now to looking at some of the governance issues that come with maybe considering an exploratory fishery in international waters, or indeed commercial fisheries in the future. So Christina and I will share this presentation. Christina, as many of you will know, is an advisor to IUCN and a long-time champion of the high seas negotiations, which will potentially have some bearing on these issues. So with that, I will bring Christina in to give an overview of the regulatory frameworks.
Well, thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you all for being here today. I have certainly learned a lot from my colleagues, and I'm looking forward to our discussion where we're getting some interesting questions. I'm just going to focus my few minutes shared with Glenn sort of about the lure of the mesopelagic. What can we learn from existing practice? What can we learn and what can we hope for from the negotiations for this new international legally binding agreement for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction? Now you know why we call it the BB&J agreement. We've been talking a lot about lanternfish, but I think what it's important to realize is that these lanternfish don't live alone. And yes, they are the core feedstock for many of our commercially important species, but they're also an intimate part of a much wider ecosystem. I now live close to Woods Hole Oceanographic, where I actually sort of cut my teeth on ocean science as a traditional US domestic lawyer. I started to look at the laws and policies affecting marine biodiversity. And one of the things you learn is to look for who else lives there, who eats whom, and who depends on whom. And in this case, I'm hoping you're seeing that these jellies down here are these fascinating 150-foot, 45-meter flying saucers, if you will, of an interconnected, practically intelligence that is communicating in a core of a colonial creature. There are also ctenophores and other types of organisms that also play a role in sequestration of CO2. Having learned from Larry Maiden that most of these creatures are just sort of brought up in nets as a bunch of jelly at the bottom, it's only now that we have the technologies from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution that we're able to see these creatures in situ and understand what role they're playing in the ecosystem, a vital piece of knowledge, but we're still not there yet. That was because what we're also learning is that these lanternfish and other creatures of the mesopelagic may play a critical role in global climate processes. And for me, it really helps to underscore the importance of an integrated approach that reflects this ocean climate, ocean earth connectivity, and the need to be looking at how activities in one region can affect another, which helps, at least for me, to drive home the point of the need for coherence and consistency from one ocean basin to the other. And this is very much the case for how we are managing our fisheries, including new and exploratory fisheries that may be mesopelagic. Next slide, please. But what we are faced with today is sort of a sea of confusion in a very fragmented ocean governance system. Well, it's not confusing for some, it's very simple. It's the regulatory bodies are off on the right, the regional fisheries management organizations for fishing, International Maritime Organization for shipping, and the International Seabed Authority for any future seabed mining. But what's also important to realize is that these bodies and treaties on the left also are trying to work hard to conserve endangered species. They're working hard to promote sustainable use, conservation, spatial planning. But it's only CITES, this Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, that has any teeth when it comes to commercial activities, because it can say, it states parties can say what species are considered to be so threatened and endangered that you need to have real restrictions on their international trade, including a non-detriment finding before these species can be landed. But if you don't have the knowledge, can you really create a non-detriment finding if the species are not endangered yet? What can you do to make sure they don't become endangered? Next slide, please. Well, sorry for the words on here, but it's important to try to understand that we do have a structure and framework in place for managing fisheries, but I would argue that it is still very fragmentary and incomplete. We have the Constitution for the Ocean that is UNCLOS, but the UN Fish Stocks Agreement was developed in 1995, largely because of the weaknesses, the vague wording of the UNCLOS provisions. So the UN Fish Stocks Agreement actually helps to set conditions for cooperation through the regional fisheries management organizations. It calls for ecosystem-based management, understanding before you go, precautionary catch levels. But these must be translated into action by the regional fisheries management organizations. We have both tuna and non-tuna regional fisheries management organizations. The tuna RFMOs clearly have no legal mandate because these lanternfish don't look too much like a tuna or tuna-like species. We do have a series of non-tuna regional fisheries management organizations that have theoretically broad regional mandates, but I cut my teeth on deep sea bottom fisheries that had started in the 1960s and 1970s and did not get to be, go back please, regulated until after 2005. And this was only when the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, acted to adopt a series of resolutions calling on first, not to fish on unregulated fisheries, but to apply the principles of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement to discrete orange roughy fish stocks, if you will, but also to take urgent measures to protect their habitat, in this case, deep seabed, corals, spongers, other sorts of erect structures on the sea floor. Next, I better stop waving my hands when I speak. But what we're looking at potentially is another gold rush. If we do not have effective structures to assess the potential sustainability of these mesopelagic fish stocks, or to actually assess their full range of ecological and ecosystem service impacts on the global community. So if we're to avoid the tragedy of commons, we can hopefully follow the wise words of Elinor Ostrom, who actually said we can avoid the tragedy of commons if we exercise a sense of shared responsibility and restraint, a sense of conditional access where there are rules imposed on the community before you actually can seek out and exploit these resources that are belonging to all. And of course, you need a system of effective enforcement. I'm heartened by the work that IDDRI has been doing on monitoring, control, and surveillance. The tools and technologies that have developed recently do hold some hope that we can start to keep an eye on what fishing vessels are doing, where they're going, and even what they're bringing home. Next slide. So what is the potential role for the UN agreement for marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction? Just a word of hope. We've heard from President Rena Lee, the dual photographs in the front of the room, that negotiations are likely to reconvene in August of next year. But that means it will have been a year since we have all been able to gather together in New York. So the meeting in next August is hopefully the fourth, was hopefully the final meeting of 4, where we've spent 2 weeks together to negotiate the terms of this new agreement. Next slide. What got me interested in mesopelagic fisheries from the BBNJ agreement perspective was actually trying to look at a case study for sort of illuminating the potential role of the impact assessment provisions under the BBNJ agreement. The BBNJ agreement will be addressing both the, well, a full range of issues, environmental impact assessments, marine protected areas, capacity building and technology transfer, and the use of marine genetic resources. Here we're focusing on environmental impact assessments, but I would say the whole rest of the package is absolutely vital. Environmental impact assessments are best rolled out when you have a firm environmental objective, conservation and sustainable use, or use that is sustainable, triggers such as an activity that is likely to cause a significant adverse impact, or even more precautionary, that is going to cause more than a minor or transitory effect. The impact assessment is supposed to serve to provide an informed decision, but you really need to know what you're actually getting yourself into if you're going to make an informed decision. And arguably, we're not there yet with respect to mesopelagic fisheries. But some of the more important, well, not more important, but equally important to this substantive provisions for environmental impact assessments are the provisions for wide consultation, proactive consultation, and inclusive participation and reasoned decision makings with the wider international community. And of course, the ability to review and to ensure that the decision makers are accountable to the wider international community for their management of a particular activity. Next slide, as we'll see with respect to most regional fisheries management organizations, is that the Fish Stocks Agreement does say you should have a exploration of the potential sustainability of a fish stock for new and emerging fisheries, but they don't talk about what is the potential ecosystem effect of these new and exploratory fisheries. That had to be developed by subsequent UN General Assembly resolutions that at least pertain to deep sea bottom habitats, but don't yet actually look at the wider impacts of fisheries on the water column impacts. Regional fisheries management organizations, some have an actual impact assessment that is looking, will this fishery cause a significant adverse impact? And if so, that fishery is not supposed to be approved according to the terms of the UN General Assembly resolutions. So they're relatively good in terms of the impact assessment processes, they can be at least, but what is lacking in any of the RFMO procedures is a requirement for consultation and participation with the wider international community. And similarly, without that, there is no review or accountability for the decisions made. And this needs to be feeding back into what is the objective? How are we doing to ensure that our activities are in fact sustainable, they're not causing significant adverse impacts, and that they are indeed protecting biodiversity in the marine environment, as is promised under the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. So with that, I'll bring my portion of the discussion to a close, but just say Glenn and I have another report forthcoming that is really looking at the potential to go beyond just simply environmental impact assessments in the BBNJ treaty, which are very project level and site specific. And as we learned from Rachel, some fish stocks may be just here, but not here. And if you're only looking where they're abundant, you're not going to understand what the consequences are in this other region, because it may be their spawning area. And there's many best practice gaps. The strategic environmental assessment is proposed in the draft text. But we can see here through this case study on mesopelagic fisheries how important they are to ensure informed decisions as to what the wider impacts may be. But in the case of where you really don't have enough scientific information, we need both global scientific cooperation through the UN decade, but also provisions for regional assessments where we truly understand what is going on, what are the pressures and drivers in a particular region that can pull all the stakeholders and the sectoral and conservation bodies together for a common cause to understand what is going on in our ocean, what the triggers are for the next stage, and how can we better manage, sustain, and protect our shared global ocean commons. With that, I'll turn it over to Glenn. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christina. I see that there's a lot of interesting questions already coming through in the question and answer. So I'll try and keep my few slides to be reasonably brief here, but I just wanted to give a quick summary of some of the different governance options that we explored in the report mentioned earlier. assuming that first an exploratory fishery would take place and then potentially a commercial fishery later on at some point in the future. And so the options that we looked at are all listed here on the slide. So the first option would be going through the existing organizations that exist to manage international fisheries in international waters. So here we would say that proactive engagement by members of those organizations, which are states who have an interest in fishing, could be a positive way forward. So those regional fisheries management organizations generally have protocols on exploratory fisheries. So obviously they can be used to regulate these initial forays into exploitation. Members could ensure that the potential impacts on the broader ecosystem services be taken into account and not just on the habitat itself or on the stocks themselves. Consultation and participation of observers and broader participation more generally, because these organizations are generally composed of states with a kind of economic interest in exploiting the fishery. And so for most processes, there isn't external stakeholder consultation or indeed an opportunity for states that don't have an interest in fishing to have their voice heard. And of course, when we're talking about a discrete fishery, that may not be so bad, but when we're talking about the mesopelagic and there are potential consequences on carbon storage, clearly there is a need there to be a bit more cautious. International guidelines are also an option. We know that the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, already has a code of conduct for responsible fisheries and has also developed international guidelines on the management of deep sea fisheries in the high seas. This would be a great idea for the future. For now, it seems clear that we don't know enough really to recommend best practices and to make sure that it is sustainable. So this is something that could be floated and considered as we develop the science and as we understand more. The idea of having a UN General Assembly resolution, as Christina mentioned, there's already a resolution on high seas bottom fisheries. And so something similar could be done for mesopelagic fisheries that could call for, a high level of precaution when developing these fisheries, ensuring that states cooperate and have a strategic assessment of the ecosystems, and making sure that any fishery has an extensive or comprehensive impact assessment done for it. And ideally, those activities then would not be allowed to proceed unless we could show that there wasn't going to be a significant impact on ecosystem services. And perhaps at the sort of more strict end of the scale, what was done for bottom fisheries is having certain areas closed to fishing where there is a risk of significant adverse impacts. And so something like a resolution could be good, I think, for creating momentum and sort of raising this awareness. What I would say is that experience with those bottom fisheries resolutions is that it highlighted the issue, but doesn't seem to be enough on its own to ensure that ecosystems are truly protected. And in many cases, the regional fisheries management organizations, or more precisely their members, have been slow to implement those resolutions. And so perhaps good for raising awareness and building momentum, but sort of slow impact actually on the governance framework. Christina mentioned the ongoing high seas treaty negotiations. It's clear that these negotiations could, or that the eventual treaty could bring a lot of support to regulating mesopelagic fisheries. They could assist RFMOs either through collating the best available science, ensuring there's an opportunity to engage stakeholders, ensuring sort of more coherence between different management bodies. And also providing a sort of overarching set of governance principles that can kind of mainstream biodiversity into all of these organizations. The High Seas Treaty also has an element focused on environmental assessments. And so it could strengthen both the assessments for individual fisheries, so to make sure that any impact assessment includes questions of carbon capture from fisheries and the impacts on habitats and ecosystem services. But it could also provide for these broader strategic environmental assessments And we see that that could be something very useful in the case of a topic like mesopelagic fisheries, where the science isn't very strong yet, and the possibility of commercial exploitation is really just beginning. The treaty could also eventually provide for marine protected areas. And so depending on what the criteria for designating a protected area will be, we could envisage that a protected area could be created for a mesopelagic ecosystem based, for example, on its carbon capture capability, or based on its link to the food web as a whole. And finally, we also considered the possibility of a moratorium in the meantime, pausing or agreeing to pause commercial fishing until there's a time where we understand the science better and we can actually build proper regulations that can effectively regulate these fisheries. So some scientists have already begun to call for this. We saw that the Blue Foundation new report calls for a moratorium. And there's some precedents for this. On the west coast of the US, the management body there, the Pacific Council, has already said that mesopelagic fisheries shouldn't go ahead until they've had time to sort of understand the science better. And we've also seen recently, in 2018, an agreement to prevent unregulated fishing in the Central Arctic, the high seas of the Central Arctic Ocean. And there's some similarities there in that it's a fishery of sort of a region of global significance, high level of scientific uncertainty, and the absence of a governance framework. And so what this agreement did was effectively establish a de facto commercial fishing moratorium for initially 16 years. And so states there will refrain from fishing until a management mechanism is agreed. And along with that, there are sort of fairly stringent limitations on exploratory fishing, and also a joint program of scientific research and monitoring to help states understand a bit better the kind of opening of Arctic fisheries. And so that's just a very brief overview of what we discussed in the report and the options that we floated. So I'd like to come to some questions in the remaining sort of half an hour or so. There's just some key messages here, which to sort of summarize what we've seen in this webinar, that there's a sort of critical role played by these ecosystems, but huge gaps still in our scientific knowledge. Fisheries interest is growing, but we sort of have a sort of limits on the governance framework at the moment. And so a new high seas treaty could help to strengthen the regulation, could fill in some of the gaps. And in the near term, a moratorium on mesopelagic fishing could be instituted to allow time for both the science and the governance to develop. And while I've been speaking, I see that there's a number of new questions come in. So I think what I'll do is, if we just go to the last slide, if we bring back all of the panelists on camera. And I think I'll go in order and go back to the science questions first, and give me some time while you answer to look at some of the ones that have just come in. But there are a couple of quite specific questions, Heidi, on the nature of the mesopelagic zone. So is the temperature constant? How stable is the environment as a whole? And how much do these fish travel globally, or do they sort of stay in one place?
So there's a lot of questions packed in there. Temperature is an interesting one. This midwater zone, the mesopelagic zone of the ocean, has got quite a wide range of temperatures, just like the light levels go from, not enough to allow photosynthesis to continue all the way down to the, so-called midnight zone. The temperatures also vary very widely, from 10 or 20 degrees Celsius at the base of the sunlit zone down to about 4 degrees Celsius in the bottom. Is very typical globally. So depending on where you are latitudinally, but the upper temperature will be warmer or cooler, closer to the equator, warmer of course, but within the zone itself, there's a very wide range of temperatures. Other factors vary as well: oxygen concentration, a wide variety of habitat characteristics that affect the intense layering of the ecosystem within the twilight zone. It's not one big sort of homogeneous environment. So it's not stable, I guess I would say, with respect to spatial and temporal. Whether it's changing through time at the scale of climate impacts is open questions that are part of research. There's some evidence that, for instance, the layers of low oxygen may be expanding, and that may have dramatic effects on the life in the Twilight Zone. In terms of global, I mean, the Twilight Zone spans the globe. The small creatures that, you know, are really important in the vertical migration, you know, they're not moving across the whole globe as individuals. Although some of those large predators that I talked about, and Callum mentioned too, that dive deep into the Twilight Zone, they can travel thousands of kilometers, you know, each year or within their feeding seasons. So a lot of questions there and some answers, and more we want to learn about it with our research.
Perfect, thank you. And Callum, also for a science question, there was a question as to, do we know how these communities interact with things like seamounts? And also a question as to how this carbonate system works that I see you may have answered in the chat, but if you could give us a quick summary of that, that would be helpful.
So how do they interact with seamounts? Well, one of the things in the marine environment is that seamounts are seen as being kind of oases of higher productivity. And I mean, these seamounts may well be below the epipelagic zone. They may peak well below the epipelagic zone, but nonetheless, they're concentrating food and nutrients for the animals that live on and around them. And how are they doing that? Well, one of the things that happens with a seamount, if you've got your seamount there, is that the currents kind of bring up and over and around a seamount. And what the hypothesis is that these mesopelagic fish and other life are kind of migrating up and down, and then they get kind of stuck on the seamount, if you like, so that there's this sort of concentrating effect of food that is, you know, in part of this up and down migration, but it's being concentrated around the seamount and its flanks, accessible for the fish and other sorts of creatures that are living there. So that's, again, you know, we got huge amounts to learn about this zone, and the amount of research that has been done up to now is limited, as I'm sure Heidi would agree, and we need to find out more about how that works. The gut carbonate story is very interesting in that my co-author, Rod Wilson, has been looking into this in some detail, but essentially the carbonates come out of the seawater. They're kind of breathed in, inhaled by the fish, essentially. And in an osmoregulatory process, they have to excrete that, and they do it by precipitating these carbonate rocks in the gut. And the precipitation releases CO2, as precipitation of calcium carbonate does, and that the hypothesis is that those gut carbonates are mainly formed at depth, while the animals are digesting food which has been brought down from near the surface during these vertical migrations. And then they kind of go up again, and some of those carbonates may be pushed out by the resumption of feeding, and essentially then would transfer bicarbonate up into surface waters, which would counteract ocean acidification up there. And so essentially you're transferring alkalinity from the deep ocean to the shallow ocean. And that's a kind of different limb of the shuttling function that the animals are performing in relation to organic carbon that they're capturing near the surface and releasing deeper down. So it's an interesting hypothesis. Again, needs more study. And I think that, but given the potential numbers of animals involved, and if Rachel can find any of them in sufficient abundance, and that they do exist in the sort of numbers that we're told they exist in, then this could be a significant process at a planetary scale. And we really need to understand more about it. So I'm delighted that there's this research underway. There's a new opportunity with the UN International Decade of Science for Sustainable Development. And I think that, you know, pausing commercial level exploitation during that period, tying in research into this UN decade of research would be a really good thing to do.
And speaking of that gap between the number of fish expected, and perhaps Heidi can come back to you, there does seem to be a gap between the estimates of biomass and then the amount being caught in these sort of exploratory trawls. How do we understand that as non-scientists like myself?
Well, I don't have the definitive answer for sure, but I think an important part of it is avoidance that the animals are exhibiting when they detect the pressure waves or turbulence associated with nets or other systems that we are dragging through the water. Evolutionarily, they're exquisitely adapted to avoid a giant predator coming up from behind or from the side. And what does a net look like? I would imagine if you're a tiny fish in the mesopelagic. So where do the big numbers come from? A lot of that evidence of large amounts of biomass come from acoustic soundings. And this is a very active area of research and development, because the idea is we transmit sound waves into the ocean. We sit at a receiver somewhere on a ship or on a tow body, and we listen for what sound comes back, echoing off whatever is in the environment. And the organisms that live in the Twilight Zone, many of them are very good at bouncing certain frequencies of sound back, and we can detect that signal. Getting from the sound bounce back to an estimate of how many or how much mass of animals is there involves some assumptions and parameters. And part of the research activities we're undertaking are to make sure that we have well-founded estimates of the parameters, and we're making good assumptions to go between sound signals and estimates of what kinds of animals are there and how many of them are there. So I'll stop there, I think.
That leads nicely to perhaps a question I'll pose to you, Rachel, is what sort of innovations have you been trying in the project to increase catch, or indeed how do you go about catching these fish? And perhaps I'll pose another question to you, which is which countries are currently sort of most interested or involved in these projects?
All right, yeah, well, I can do the first one. I'll be just piggybacking a bit on what Heidi was talking about, the acoustics. Obviously, acoustics is what we're using so far, and what we have been using, and it's what's been giving us these really high estimates. But what we found though is that, well, as Christina was showing us these infographics about what's down there and all the jellyfish, some of these jellyfish also have these same air bubbles inside them. So when we're using the acoustics, it's reflecting back and it looks like there's loads of fish down there. And you can argue that you can use jellyfish commercially as well, but when you're pulling up what you think is a really big load of commercially valued mesopelagic fish, you're coming up with nothing, because these jellyfish are just going through the net. So once you're popping your champagne and taking up the net, there's nothing there, right? So it's difficult to know what's down there. So like the Institute of Marine Research in Norway just got a really big project looking at broadband acoustics, going down, trying to find out from more angles, trying to find out an actual image of what's down there, so that you know before you take it up what's going to come up. We've also done research on the trawls themselves. Some are really effective, but really they're effective in terms of getting the resource up, but they're very costly. There's a lot of energy to pull them up. And then you have to, again, do the trade-off analysis of what you want. Do you need more fish, or do you want it to be less expensive to pull up and do it more often? So that's part of the trade-off analysis that we're working on as well. But as I said, we're generally struggling getting the fish. In terms of the countries, as I mentioned, this is a really expensive fishery. Obviously, you'll have the fishing nations, the big ones. Norway really wants to get into this. Spain is really big on this. They're the ones that are really going out a lot and you're doing the trial fisheries. The US, I'm assuming, is doing this as well, but it's going to be the big fishing nations that are going to have the economy for it, at least at this exploratory phase when we don't know where they are and we're just out blindly searching for it, hoping we'll find them.
Great, thank you. And certainly just from my sort of experience trying to find out more about who's interested in these fisheries at this early stage, I think it's quite difficult to know who, you know, unless they're making public announcements about the trials, it may not be possible to know who's planning what. So it's great that projects like yours are bringing some of those actors in. Christina, I'll come to you now and shift from science a bit to governance. There's a lot of good governance questions in here. Someone has asked about the regional seas programs and if they might play any role in this. Perhaps I could start you off with that.
Well, thank you. I think the regional seas programs have an important role to play in terms of helping and being informed by these regional environmental assessments. It shouldn't only be about mesopelagic fisheries, but it should be a joint enterprise between all the relevant organizations, as ideally part of the implementation of the BBNJ agreement is to gain a better understanding of what are the stressors, drivers, pressures on this particular ocean region. So yes, the members of regional seas organizations should be part and parcel of these environmental assessments, together with the member states of the RFMOs and other organizations, but also there needs to be a role for people and organizations outside the region, for the scientists who have an expertise in this type of ecosystem that are outside the region. When we start to hone in too quickly on this is a regional problem, it goes for a regional solution, you start to lose out on this interconnectedness and the need for global consistency and coherence across all of it. So it's yes, but. Thank you.
And I'll stick with you, Christina, while you're there. There was also a question as to, you mentioned that there's a lack of accountability, and I think there were some comments in the chat box that RFMOs are accountable to their members, but if I understood correctly, you were thinking a bit more broadly, so I'll perhaps give you a chance to clarify what you mean there.
Thank you. I mean, I think you said it very well in your part of the presentation, is what we're talking about is accountability to the global community. That was because these fisheries are not just about the fish and how do you exploit them most efficiently, but also about their role in the ecosystem, their role in providing these carbon sequestration services, their role in the biological carbon pump, as well as the biodiversity that is part of this strange and unusual and fascinating realm of the deeper ocean. So that accountability, what we saw, at least with the deep sea bottom fisheries through the UN General Assembly resolution in 2006, there's a requirement for RFMOs to report back to the United Nations General Assembly on a periodic basis as to what they are doing and how they are doing on implementing this resolution, which basically called for very specific prior assessments of the impacts of this deep sea bottom fishery and an obligation not to approve the fishery unless you can show that it would not cause significant adverse impacts. As we've seen, the implementation has been highly unequal, but I would argue it's only because of this global level accountability that you've had the extent of implementation that you've had, and it needs to be to the wider global community of states, as well as wider community of stakeholders. Thanks.
Thank you, Christina. I'm jumping back and forth between the science and regulation just to make sure we have a fair spread of all the questions. But they're obviously very linked. There's a question about bycatch and do we know about what the bycatch is likely to be and how targeted the fishery can be. Rachel, I think you already mentioned some of this, and then perhaps after Heidi or Callum can jump in.
Yeah, I did mention it. And again, it's just bearing in mind that this is from the results from the Norwegian fisheries. In general, we have very little to no bycatch. And as I mentioned, it's primarily because we're towing really slowly. The fish are swimming out of it. They're swimming right out of the nets. And we have checked this with video. We've used GoPro cameras to actually check whether or not this was true. We did catch a lot of krill with it sometimes. That's also part of the same mesopelagic trial fishery that we're entrusted to do right now in this project. So the last catch that we had, that was only krill. We found no Mueller's pearl site at all, which is what we expected to find. But in general, it's going to be the siphonophores, which are actually just slipping out of the nets anyways. But obviously, they're no longer alive. So it is a bycatch of sorts of that. But no commercial species have been caught yet that we've seen. But again, this is from the Norwegian results.
I don't know if either Heidi or Callum have any further thoughts on that.
I'm reminded of an anecdote about sperm whale feeding at depth, and that is that the squid beaks in sperm whale stomachs were of a size range much larger than the squid beaks that were sampled by nets by people who were trying to figure out what lived in the deep ocean. And the reason for that is that those bigger squid were able to avoid the nets far more effectively. And so essentially, as Rachel says, you know, if you're towing the net really slowly and to catch little fish like mesopelagic fish, you do need fine mesh nets, which have a huge amount of drag. Then the potential for catching these more mobile animals is going to be low. But I'm interested to hear your opinion, Rachel, on whether there is a problem from catching all those siphonophores and other sort of jelly animals down there, and whether that in itself would have some sort of impact on processes that are important.
So, I mean, the easy answer is of course, everything has a role in the ecosystem. So, and as you saw from Christina's planches too, I mean, it's part of the ecosystem in that area, in that region. And it will have an effect. We don't know what it is though. I mean, obviously, you probably know too, there's a big push for starting jellyfish harvesting as well, because it's been challenges in many areas. And that's also with a lot of implications for the ecosystem and what role they have. So that's also another fishery that would probably need a really big study in itself of the implications of fishing on it.
Yeah, I'll just add a word of emphasis to that. In our project, preliminary or early results are suggesting that the biomass, the abundance of gelatinous animals in the mesopelagic may be higher than we previously thought. They're difficult to study, but techniques like in situ sampling for environmental DNA are suggesting that they may be much more important than we previously thought. And I'll just mention that bringing back the idea of, you know, the combination, not just of provisioning services, but also supporting and regulating services. There's a lot of reason to think these gelatinous animals play a big role, for instance, in the carbon cycle. Some of them go through that daily migration that I talked about. Things like salps, for instance, produce fecal pellets. After they feed in the surface layer, they produce fecal pellets that are very dense and sink rapidly into the deep ocean. They're carrying carbon with them. So we have to be very careful about what the impact might be of maybe non-traditional untargeted or bycatch, let's say.
Great, thank you. I see Christina making notes. So I'm going to come back to you again now, back to some of the regulatory issues. There is a question as to, one of the slides suggests that there's not many organizations that really have teeth and strength for enforcement, and CITES was mentioned as one that does. I wonder, you know, is that because in practice it's difficult to enforce, or states don't agree, or is it that the organizations are sort of not set up properly? What's the sort of reason here for this lack of teeth, as it were?
Where to begin? I don't think we have until 11:30. I mean, the challenge is really that the sectoral organizations are largely dominated by those with an economic interest in the fishery or in the activity. And the regional seas organizations are not really given the power to regulate fishing, shipping, or seabed mining. And thus, organizations such as Conventional Biological Diversity, when they identify areas of ecological or biological significance, organizations such as the International Seabed Authority can say, the states can say, that's not legally binding on us. We don't need to listen to that sort of scientific advice. So there's no provision for the transmission of common scientific advice, a common understanding of the importance of the scientific advice. And hence it's much more a difference in short-term thinking and long-term thinking between these organizations. And that's why I think the provision of a common platform for scientific exploration, assessments, and understanding of what are these pressures and drivers in the ocean right now is going to be so fundamentally important. I would say, in the Arctic Ocean, as it is melting and undergoing this huge transformation, the states parties who were involved in the region took upon themselves to say, we will not permit our states, our flag vessels, to go fishing in this region for 16 years in order for us to undertake the type of research that is required to ensure that any fishing that occurred would in fact be sustainable. So this is sort of why you need an adjustment in the power distribution that makes this a truly shared responsibility. It's not just those organizations that regulate, but those organizations and peoples who feel the impacts of those regulations if we're going to have a truly sustainable and equitable and resilient ocean future.
Now, I noticed there's, to go to the other poll, there's a few comments about the Antarctic Treaty and the relevance there. And this often comes up, of course, because CAMLAR, the Commission for the Antarctic Living Resources, is quite unique in a way, sort of quite environmentally focused. It's not a traditional fisheries management organization, but it does manage fisheries. And so there's a number of questions there as to what role could it play? And so I'll answer that one at least briefly, is that, it would play a role in the Antarctic. And of course, we could use that as inspiration for regulating mesopelagic fisheries. But I tend to see CAMLAR as being just quite unique, and it is quite apart in many ways from other governance organizations. Perhaps to give it back to Christina.
Just to say, I mean, we have a lot to learn from CAMLAR. That's in terms of that activities are not approved until you can actually conduct the scientific research that is needed to understand the ecological relationships between the harvested and the dependent and related populations. And I think, in this case, it's essential that we do look at the non-traditional, non-target species that we really do start to understand. And CAMLAR is changing. It's becoming much more difficult for them to actually exercise their role as the stewards of the Southern Ocean. I think there's many in the NGO community who would start to say that we do need to start looking at what is going on in that whole of the region in order to give wider global accountability.
I see that time is approaching, and I don't want to keep people too late. So perhaps a last quick fire round, if everyone would just give a short response on their thoughts about having a moratorium and sort of where that would sit in the sort of science and the framework. So perhaps we can just go in order that we spoke. So Heidi, I'll start with you.
Well, so certainly a moratorium is one strategy. I'm not going to weigh in on that directly, but certainly I would support, and I know my team supports, the need for more research and better knowledge. And I know that's embedded in the idea of a moratorium, is until we have the knowledge we need to sustainably manage. And we certainly support that.
And Callum?
So I think one of the issues around why a moratorium or pause or whatever you want to call it on mesopelagic fishing would be wise is not just because of the uncertainties involved in exploiting these fish, but because the inequity between countries. That we've seen that already in high seas fisheries for epipelagic fish, where a handful of countries are reaping the majority of benefits. Many of those fisheries are excessive, species are becoming overexploited, and essentially the benefits are not being shared from those fisheries widely around the global community. And I think in terms of the mesopelagic realm, this is a group of species that would be exploitable only by a handful of nations. And I think that we need to think harder about global equity as well as the ecological wisdom of exploiting this area.
Thanks, Callum. Rachel?
Yeah, so from, again, a Norwegian perspective, I mean, we effectively have a moratorium. We only have a test trial fishery on this. Norwegian government is really strict about setting out any kind of fishery. It took more than a decade from we started even looking at plankton before they even started trial fishing. So it's not something I expect to be a commercial fishery. The directorate gives out licenses for 1 year at a time. To participants with no guarantee at all. So it's really effectively only a trial fishery to find out whether or not it would be even sustainable to try it. I question a moratorium, though, at a global level for the same reasons why this is challenging with the BBNJ treaty right now. Who's going to enforce it? What countries will say no? I can guess Norway, Russia, EU, the big ones that Callum mentioned. You need everybody to want to do this. And as opposed to the Arctic, where there isn't a fishery because it's ice covered, there is fish out there. There is a potential to go out and fish right now. So getting countries to sign up for a moratorium over decades for something that they could almost smell, it would be difficult, I think, but it's worth a try.
And Christina?
Well, I think we can learn from the Arctic, Central Arctic Ocean moratorium, which is exactly a freeze on fishing and a collaborative effort to try to understand more about the Central Arctic Ocean and its role in both regional and wider global processes. And this is a moratorium that Russia, as well as Norway and the United States, did agree to. So looking at what is to gain from a pause, a global commitment to say, no, we are going to better understand what this ecosystem is, what it does, who benefits, and how, would be quite advisable. We have the vehicle of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. If somebody wants to put together a global collaborative program that can actually lift the capacity of all states to better understand this fascinating realm, how to use new tools such as the environmental DNA, to better understand who is in the community and how they're passing. So it intertwines with all the various elements of the BBNJ treaty. And so a commitment by states to the circular economy, as we know they're also committed to. Are there substitutes for this never-ending demand for fish meal and nutraceuticals? My husband is investing in seaweed companies, algae companies that are operating on land in new, more sustainable ways. So can we not be creative in trying to repurpose and redesign and rethink what our technology may in the future enable us to do? We don't necessarily need to follow through on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christina. Well, we're just over time, so I'm going to use my prerogative as moderator and not address the thorny question of a moratorium myself. But what is clear, I mean, this is a first step for IDDRI as an organization working on this issue. Of course, there's a huge number of regulatory bodies and researchers that are potentially relevant to these questions. And so it's much like the high seas negotiations, it's a very complex issue, and any question of regulation, moratorium, there's clearly a huge number of people that would need to be engaged in that. So it's been wonderful for me to have the perspective of two high regarded scientists, one of these EU projects, and then on the governance as well today. So thank you very much to all of the panelists. I will also say the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative has a working group on fisheries and a subgroup of that working on mesopelagic fisheries. So if you are involved in science and are interested in that, then I could point you to that. As I say, the webinar has been recorded, and we'll send out the recording with the 2 reports that were mentioned. Otherwise, I'll say thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn.